Hey everyone, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf 90 of Pesachim. What can I say about Daf 90? It's cool because it's Daf 90. It's like we're getting close to 100, which is exciting. But it's complicated. It's a complex one. You know, you get the feeling when it's going to be a long Daf, like a long Babylon Talmud episode. I have a feeling that it's one of those, but I guess we'll find out. Anyways, we're going to continue the discussion that we began at the end of the daf yesterday about being mechalel money of Hekdesh on a korban pesach. We're going to kind of continue that discussion, and also the discussion in general about is kodshim, is things that are Hekdesh, are they mamun bailim or mamun gavoa? Alright. And then spending money of the korban pesach, if people buy into your korban pesach, can you spend that money on your own things? And then we get into a new Mishnah. About halfway in, we start a new Mishnah about zavs. And what else do we talk about in that Mishnah? Oh yeah, shomeres yom keneged yom. Those kind of fun inyanim in terms of can they be included in the korban pesach. And it could be a little bit clarifying, which is cool. Let us get started. We are going to start on Daf Pei Tesam Beis, 3 lines from the bottom. Omer Ula, Vitem Reb Oshaya, says Ula, some say it was Taka Reb Oshaya, Efsher Yade Chevrin, probably Chevrin. Bavloe Taimedai Milsa. Maybe our Babylonian friends can explain this to us. What was the last thing that we said yesterday? If we actually jump up a few lines on Daf Pei Tesam Beis to the second wide line, it says Tanu Rabbanim. The rabbis taught Hamamane Acherim Ima Al Pischa Val Chagigasu Moshe B'Yado Chulin. That is what we're going. That's what we're talking about. A fellow who has other people buy into his korban pesach. He buys a korban pesach, and then some of his friends give him some money and they join him. So that money is chulin. Alright, that's what it says. It says, the money that people spend to buy in to his korban pesach is chulin. The question is why? The korban pesach is kodshim. When these people set aside money to buy into a korban pesach, they're setting aside money for a korban. That's hekdesh. So you have money that's hekdesh that they're giving to somebody to buy into a korban that's hekdesh. How does this money magically become chulin? How does money become chulin in general? If you have money that's hekdesh and you want to be able to spend it, so let's say you could take a korban that's chulin, an animal that's chulin, you could transfer the kedusha of the money onto the animal. Now the animal becomes kadosh, you bring it as a korban, and the money is now chulin. But that, the kedusha has to go on to something chulin, right? So you take kedusha, you transfer it onto chulin. The chulin now becomes kadosh, and the money now becomes chulin. It takes its place. But in this case, you have money that somebody set aside for a korban, so it's hekdesh. The money is hekdesh. In order to make it un-hekdesh, you would have to transfer the hekdesh onto chulin, but you're using it to buy into a korban. The korban's also hekdesh. So how magically is this money becoming chulin? That's what Ula v'itemer Reb Oshaya wants to figure out. So again, Omer Ula v'itemer Reb Oshaya, Efsher Yadei Chavin Bavloi Taimedahai Milsa. Maybe our friends in Babylonia know the answer to this concept of Zehifish Talal Lepischo, that this fellow with the korban pesach set aside a sheep to be a korban pesach. V'zehifish Mos Lepischo. And then his friends who are buying into his korban pesach set aside money for a korban pesach. How can this money that's hekdesh become chulin by transferring it onto the korban which is hekdesh? Dikatani moshe b'yadu chulin, as the Brisa says that magically this money is chulin. Everyone got the question? Good. Omer Abaye. Now Abaye says, now don't think that this is gonna get clear. I'm going to try to sort of hold our hand as we go through this next bit of Gemara that is I don't know if the right word to say is choppy, but it certainly doesn't flow well. That's to say the least. You have to really massage the neck until like the daf gets wide. You really have to massage this Gemara to kind of make it make sense. Abaye says Abaye, Ilavdu ukme Reb Oshaya le'ahi b'memana zona al pischo v'rebihi hav'mukmina la le'ahi b'kachim kalim v'alibu Reb Yossi Aglili dama kachim kalim mamun bailimhu. Oh my gosh. Alright. Fine. Amar Abaye says Abaye, Ilavdu ukme Reb Oshaya le'ahi b'memana zona al pischo v'rebihi. Okay, if not for the fact that Reb Oshaya established that and it to be a case of when a person, so he sleeps with a prostitute, and then there's something called Esnan Zona and Mechir Kelev. Right? Esnan Zona is payment for a prostitute, and Mechir Kelev is payment for a dog. So you can't use payment for a prostitute or payment for a dog, for kachim. So we're going to get to this case in a few minutes, but let's just say for now that Reb Oshaya establishes that case regarding Esnan Zona to be referring to a korban pesach, i.e. that somebody in his group is a prostitute that he slept with and now he needs to pay, and as payment he basically as her payment she can join in on the korban pesach. V'Rebbe, and this is Rebbe's opinion. So if not for that fact, if not for the fact that we would say that Mishnah regarding Esnan Zona is Rebbe, Havamukmina la leahi b'kachim kalim v'alibud Reb Yossi Aglili. I would have said that Mishnah is talking about kachim kalim, according to Reb Yossi Aglili, the Amr kachim kalim mamun bailimhu, who says that kachim kalim is the property of the owner, i.e. if you have a shlamim or a toda or something, so it's considered to be the property of the person bringing the korban, not necessarily like mamon gavoa, like that it doesn't belong to him. It does belong to him. Aval b'pesach lo m'shayir inish b'mos, but aval b'pesach lo m'shayir inish b'mos v'adim m'shayir inish. I would have said, again, this is kind of like flipping back and forth and back and forth. However, I would have thought to say that according to Rebbe, a person would not be mashayir by the korban pesach. And what this means is that when a person sets aside an animal to be a korban pesach, he has no intention of any part of that animal belonging to him. I would have thought that Rebbe's opinion is that if a person sets aside a korban pesach, it's entirely hekdesh. However, b'mos vadim mashayir inish. However, when a person buys into the korban pesach, right? So if you have Reuven as a korban pesach and Shimon is paying to be part of Reuven's korban pesach, certainly Shimon, when he sets aside the money to give to Reuven, he has intention that not all of that the money can be used for whatever Reuven wants, and therefore it's not necessarily hekdesh. And when a person sets aside money, he sets it aside with the intention that the person who he's giving to can spend it as he wants. And therefore, in the case of this korban pesach that a friend is buying into, so when Shimon buys into Reuven's korban pesach, his intention is that Reuven could spend it as he wishes, and therefore, v'ha Rebbe, and therefore this brisa that we started with that says Hamamana acherim imo al pischo v'achagigaso moshe b'yadu chulin, when we say that somebody who has his friends buy into his korban pesach or his korban chagiga, the chagigas yodalit, the chagiga that they eat as the main meal at the seder. So if somebody buys into that, the money is chulin, as we just explained, that we would say that Rebbe's opinion is that when Shimon sets aside the money to give to Reuven to buy into his Pesach, he's setting it aside assuming that Reuven can spend it as he wishes, and therefore it's chulin. And for this reason, that is why the money is chulin in that case. Uvmaos shevadai mishayir inish. And once again, we're reiterating that by money, a person will sort of leave it with the intention that his friend can spend it as he wishes. And continues the Gemara that Abaye is saying that which Reb Oshaya establishes this Mishnah that we're going to get to in a few minutes, in the context of Esna and Zona, to be like Rebbe, lo mukmina la le ana kirebi. I wouldn't have thought, says Abaye, to establish that Mishnah like Rebbe. De pesach lo mishayir inish, because I would say that, but I would think that Rebbe's opinion would be that by a korban pesach, a person would not leave over anything from himself. Meaning, if he sets aside a korban pesach, it's going to be Hekdesh, 100% Hekdesh, doesn't belong to him at all. So therefore, again, when Shimon sets aside money to give to Ruvain, to pay him to join his korban pesach, so Shimon, when he sets aside the money, he sets it aside intending that Ruvain can spend it as he wishes, and therefore it'll be chulin. However, when Ruvain sets aside the korban pesach, I would have thought to assume that the pesach is completely hekdesh. He's setting aside an animal to be a korban pesach. Period. Okay, and now Rabbi Oshaya establishes, however, that the Mishnah by Esna and Zona is like Rebbe, and that it's talking about a Zona who buys into the korban pesach, and from there we see, as we're going to get to soon, that Rebbe's opinion is that actually even when it comes to the korban pesach itself, when Reuven sets aside the korban pesach, he sets aside at least part of it, that it will still belong to him to some extent, and we could say that the Esna and Zona that this prostitute pays, gives to, or this part of the korban that is shaykh to the money that he would have given her as her payment, can be considered part of the animal that he reserved for himself, and therefore the Esna and Zona can be mechal on that, and it can on the part that is his. Now this brisa from the end of the day yesterday, you cannot say is Reb Yossi, because it says in that brisa that if somebody sells his ola or his shlamim, so then he hasn't accomplished anything. But Reb Yossi Aglili, we learned a few minutes ago, his opinion is that kachim kalim are mamon bailim, and therefore if shlamim is kachim kalim, you should, if you sell, you should be able to sell your kachim kalim. So therefore, you can't say that brisa is Rabbi Yossi Aglili. So it says Abaye, I have no problem saying that brisa is taka Rebbe. Okay, and because the money that Shimon sets aside to buy into Reuven's korban pesach, he set aside with the intention of it, of Reuven being able to do whatever he wants, and that's why it is chulin. Now, and now that Rabbi Oshaya said that this Mishnah that we're about to learn regarding Esna and Zona is Rebbe, and it's talking about somebody who sets aside his korban pesach, somebody who includes a Zona in his korban pesach, so then Shmamina desvir le afilu bepischo mishayir inish. So we see that how could this Esna and Zona become chulin on his korban pesach? It must mean that he at least reserves some part of the korban pesach to be in his own ownership. All right, Maihi. Now, what is this mysterious Mishnah that Rabbi Oshaya is saying is Rebbe, and in the context of korban pesach, a prostitute being included in a korban pesach? So, Maihi Rabbi Oshaya. So what is this statement of Rabbi Oshaya? It's not, as we learned in the Mishnah. Okay, if a fellow pays a prostitute with a korban, okay, I guess he was a frum fellow, and he didn't have any money on him, but he was on his way to the Beis Hamikdash to bring a korban, so he paid her with the korban instead. So the korban is mutter. It's not considered Esna and Zona, and it can still go be offered as a korban. Oaf is the chulin. Now, if he offers her birds that are not consecrated as a korban, just regular birds, hare elu asurin, they are forbidden. Basically, they're considered Esna and Zona, and now they'll be forbidden. Now, shahaya bedin. Now, I would have thought to use the following logic that uma im mukdashim, when you have a korban, shamun posa bain, that if you have a korban and the korban gets a mum, so now it's posel. Ein esnan and mechir chalalein, and esnan zona and mechir kelev, right? These things that you wouldn't be allowed to offer as a korban do not apply to korbanis. And korbanis are things that if they get a mum, they become posel. Ofis she'ena mum posel boed. So ofis, which are, if they get a mum, you could still offer them as a korban. Eino din she'en esnon u'mechir chal alein. So then certainly esnon and mechir kelev should not be, they shouldn't become esnon zona. Kilu, if a korban, which is more sensitive, that if it gets a mum, it's possible, and yet esnon does not apply to it. So a bird, which is less sensitive, that even if it gets a mum, you could still offer it as a korban. So then I would think that esnon zona shouldn't affect it, and it should also still be able to be offered as a korban. So tamlom l'chol neder l'rabos es ofis. When it says l'chol neder, all nedarim, it's coming to include, right? All is coming to include birds. Kavachom l'mukdashim miata. But if that's the case, that we've said now that birds, if you pay a prostitute with birds, so then esnan zona does apply to these birds. Well then, let's now reverse engineer this kavachomer and say, ma'ofis she'ena mum posel bo and esnan mechir chal alein, birds which are sort of, more malleable, in that, or less sensitive, in that even if they get a mum, they're still kosher to offer as a korban, and yet, as esnan zona, they become unusable. Mukdashin. So when it comes to korbanis, shamum posel, and that they're more sensitive, in that if they get a mum, they're posel. Enudin she'esnan umechir chal alein. Well then, certainly, esnan and mechir zona should apply to them. And therefore, I would think to say that if you pay a prostitute with a korban, so then it should be posel. Tamlom l'chol neder prat l'noder. The pasuk says no, l'chol neder, to the exclusion of anything that was already, meaning it has to be something that in the future you're going to, bring set aside as a korban, not something that was already set aside as a korban. Okay, and therefore, if you have kodshim that you use as esnan zona, you could still continue to offer it as a korban because esnan zona does not apply to it. At the time, the cause of achman and neder. So now the Gemara says, wait a second. So basically, the only reason why, if you have a korban that you use as payment for a prostitute, you can continue to offer it as a korban. It can still be offered as a korban, is because it says neder, to the exclusion of nadur. But if that was not the case, i.e., if we wouldn't have had this gezeres hakasuf, this pasuk, I would have thought to say, mukdashim chol iser esnan alein, chol iser esnan alein. Then I would have thought to say, logically, that just like esnan zona applies to birds, it also applies to korbanis. But a person can't make something that doesn't belong to him aser, right? Meaning, in order for esnan zona to apply to something, so then it would have to belong to him. But doesn't it seem like kodshim doesn't belong to the person, it belongs to God? So Amar Rabbi Shaya, says Rabbi Shaya, b'mimana zona al pischo v'rebihi. And there is the answer. That says Rabbi Shaya that when we say that, I would have thought to say that esnan zona would apply to a korban, it's specifically a korban pesach, according to Rebbe, as we've been learning until now, that Rebbe's opinion is that just like by money, when Shimon sets aside money to pay Reuven to join his korban pesach, he sets it aside assuming that Reuven can do what he wants with it. Also, when Reuven sets aside his korban pesach, he doesn't completely set it aside to be Hekdesh. He still reserves some part of it that is under his own ownership, and that is the part that becomes, or that we would assume would become, esnan zona. My Rebbe, what is this opinion of Rebbe that Rabbi Shai is going based on? The Tanya, as we learn in the Brayso, Yima tabayis mios miseh. If the house doesn't have enough to be a sheep, meaning the simple explanation is that if, let's say, you only have a few people in the house and they're not such big eaters, so they're not going to eat a whole lamb by themselves, so they can bring on more people. Now, hachyehu miseh michdei achila v'lo michdei mekach. What it means is you can bring him to life from a sheep. Meaning, if you have a fellow who's got a korban pesach, but he doesn't have any money to buy like other things that he needs for Yom Tif, so he could bring on other people onto the korban pesach, and they'll pay him to buy in, and now he'll have some money to spend for himself for the Yom Tif. Now, michdei achila v'lo michdei mekach, says the Gemara, says the Tanna Kama, that he can have people buy in, and he could take this money and use it for, to buy wood or things that he needs in order to eat the korban pesach, but not in order to go into business. He can't do other things with that money. Rabbi Omer says, Rabbi af michdei mekach. He can even, spend it on whatever he wants. Sheim ein lo memana acher ima pischo, that if he doesn't have any money, if mamish has a korban pesach, but he doesn't have any cash, so he can have other people join him on his korban pesach, v'al chagigaso, or on his korban chagiga, u'maut shebiyadu chulin. And then this money that the people give him will be chulin. Shamanasken ikdishu Yisrael es pischein. That is why, that this is how the Yidden set aside their korban. That, if somebody wants to buy in, he can now take this money and do what he wishes with it. Rabbi Reb Zera. Now, regarding this machlokas between between the Tanna Kama and Rebbe, that the Tanna Kama says that he can only spend the money on things related to eating, whereas Rebbe says he can even use it for like other things. So everyone agrees, both the Tanna Kama and Rebbe agree, that if we're talking about can he spend the money to buy wood so that he has a fire to cook the korban pesach, certainly he can, because it's needed to eat the korban pesach. Ki plige, where they argue, is b'matzah umar. What if he wants to spend the money to buy matzah and mar? The rabbis say, matzah and mar is a different achila, it's not the achilas korban. So therefore, you would not be able to spend the money on that. Rebbe Savar came in the Echshiro, the Pesach hu kegu for the Pesach dami. Whereas Rebbe says that since you need to eat the matzah and mar with the korban pesach, so therefore you can also spend the money on the matzah and the mar. V'chad Amar, the other opinion is, right, Machlokas Rabban and Reb Zera, so that was one opinion. This is now the other opinion. B'matzah umar nami kuli ama lo pligi. That even by matzah and mar, everyone agrees, both the Tanna Kama and Rebbe agree that you'd be able to spend the money to buy matzah and mar to eat along with the korban pesach. The chsiv, as the pasuk says, matzah smurim yochlu, that you eat the korban pesach on matzah and mar. So it's all the same boat. The machshir and the pesach ninu ke pesach dami, that since they're kind of meta things for the pesach, they're needed for the pesach. It's like the pesach. Ki pligi likach bo choluk likach bo talis. Where they argue is, can he spend this money to buy clothing for the Yom Tif? So the rabbis say, look, it says if he doesn't have enough miyos miseh, specifically regarding the seh, the korban, the sheep, the goat, you can use this money in order to buy things to make the korban pesach. No, it means that you can give life to yourself from the sheep, meaning if you can have your friends buy into the sheep and now you get a little bit of cash and you can buy some clothing for yourself, so then that would be okay as well. And according to Abaye, who says that if not for the fact that Rabbi Oshaya says that Mishnah regarding Esnan Zona is Rebbe, and it's talking about the korban pesach when a prostitute wants to join you on your korban pesach. So I would think to say that part of the pesach would become aser. So having mukmin Allah b'kodshim kalim v'alibid Rabbi Yossi Aglili, I would have thought to say that Mishnah was dafka talking about kodshim kalim. According to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, the Amar kodshim kalim mamun bailim, who says that kodshim kalim is mamun bailim, and therefore I would have thought to say that when we would think to say that the Esnan Zona would be chal on the korban, it would be according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who says that kodshim kalim are mamun bailim. Aval b'Pesach lo m'shayir inish. I would have thought to say that Rabbi would say that when it comes to the korban Pesach, a person would be makdish completely and wouldn't leave over any part for himself that belongs to him. But didn't Rabbi just say a second ago that the Yidden specifically set aside the korban Pesach leaving themselves a little bit? Why would I have had the Havmina to say that Rebbe would say that people are entirely makdish to korban pesach? Didn't he just say that people davka are makdish to korban pesach with some of it for themselves? So I would have thought to say that no, that's specifically talking about the money. That I would have thought to say that Rebbe is saying that the money that this person gets for having his neighbors buy into the korban pesach, that is davka. The neighbors set it aside so that he could spend it to buy clothing or whatever it is, but not necessarily talking about the animal itself. To which Abai is saying from the fact that Rabbi Oshaya says that Mishnah is davka talking about a prostitute buying into a korban pesach. So we see, and it's Rebbe, so we see that Rebbe also applies that logic to the korban pesach itself, that when you set it aside, it's not entirely hekdesh. Wow, that was kind of like a roller coaster of an Amud. What can I tell you? Very, very subtle and complicated stuff. New Mishnah. Oh my gosh. This is like the easy stuff. I remember feeling this way about, I think in Masechta Eruvin, it kind of felt that way. I remember like when we got up to some Tuma and Tyra in Masechta Eruvin, it was like, oh yeah, that stuff is easy, as long as it's not like Amud B'Shus Arab Gavoa Yud V'Rachav Daled, you know? Everything's relative. So now we're up to Zavs and stuff. Easy. Zav Sharash Deirios. Okay, so you have a Zav. You saw this Zavi kind of stuff that, we don't really know what it is, thank God, but he saw it and he knew what it was. And he saw it twice. So he's a Zav Kain, which means that he's got to have 7 days without seeing this stuff, but he doesn't need to bring korbanis afterwards. So Zav Sharash Deirios Shochten Olav Bashvi'i. So now it's day 7. It's his last day of being a Zav, assuming that he doesn't see any more Ziva. So then that night he's Tahor. So you could check the korban pesach with him as part of the group. Ra'ah Shalosh, if he saw Ziva 3 times, which means that day 7 really isn't quite enough, because on day 8 he has to bring korbanis, so in Shochnan Olav B'Shmini Shalo. So then you could check korban pesach on day 8, because day 8, so he brings his korbanis and then he's good to go. Shomeres Yom Kineged Yom. If you have a woman who, as we learned the other day, in these 11 days between being a Nida, she sees Dam once, so now the next day she's got to sort of be pending in limbo, and if she sees Dam, so then she's got to wait another day. If not, so then she's pure, she's tahor by the night. So Shomeres Yom Kineged Yom, Shochten Alea B'Sheni Shela, so you could check korban pesach for on the second day, on day 2, so she sees Dam, and then the next day it's day 2. You could slaughter the korban pesach, because as long as she doesn't see Dam anymore, then she'll be tahor by the night. Ras Hashnei Yomim, if she already saw 2 days in a row, so Shochten Alea B'Shlishi, so you could slaughter on the 3rd day, because as long as she doesn't see Dam on the 3rd day, since she's tahor by the night. V'Azava Shochten Alea B'Shmini, and Azava who did see already 3 Dam 3 days in a row, but now she has had 7 days without Dam, so then on day 8 she brings korbanos, so on day 8 you'd be able to slaughter a korban pesach with her in mind. Says the Gemara, Amr of Yudah Amarav, Shochten v'Zarkan al Tvul Yom u'Mechusar Kippurim. Says Rav Yudah in the name of Rav that you could check the korban pesach for a Tvul Yom, somebody who already went to mikvah. So let's say a Zav on day 7. So he goes to the mikvah on day 7, but he's a Tvul Yom. He's got to wait until Hayr of Shemesh. He's got to wait until the evening until he is actually tahor. But once the evening comes, he's good to go. U'Mechusar Kippurim. When you have a fellow, so let's say a Zav Gadol, right? So it's now day 8, and he has to bring his korbanos. Also, you can slaughter a korban pesach for him, because he just brings the korbanos and he's good to go. Now, interestingly, however, you would not slaughter the korban pesach for a tmei sheretz, right? This is somebody who a dead sheretz fell on him, and he'll be tahor at night, but he just has to go to the mikvah first. So it's interesting that Rav is saying that you cannot slaughter the korban pesach for a tmei sheretz. Ula says no, you can even slaughter korban pesach for tmei sheretz, because what's the big deal? He goes to the mikveh and he's tahor that night. So the Rav, Ma'ishna Tvul Yom, what's the difference between a Tvul Yom and a tmei sheretz? Right? The Rav, Ma'ishna Tvul Yom, the Chazi L'orta. What's the deal with the Tvul Yom? Somebody already went to the mikvah. A Zav on day 7, he goes to the mikvah, he's just got to wait till the night. Rav says that you'd be allowed to slaughter the korban pesach with him in mind. Why? Well, because you just got to wait a little bit, and comes the nighttime, he'll be tahor. Tmei sheretz nami chazi le'urta. Well, somebody who's tummy from sheretz, that night will be fine as well. So mechusar tvila. So the Gemara says, yeah, but the tmei sheretz hasn't yet gone to the mikveh yet, and as long as he doesn't go to the mikveh, so then he's not going to be able to eat that night. Tvul yom nami mechusar hayav shemesh. But a tvul yom also, it's not, there's still a missing ingredient. The sun needs to set. But the Gemara says, yeah, but shimshim emela arva, the sun is going to set. You could be assured that the sun is going to set. So really there's nothing else that he needs to do, just wait, and then he'll be good to go, as opposed to a tmei sheretz, he still has to do something. He has to go to the mikveh. But mechusar kippurim nami, ha mechusar kapara, but a mechusar, right? Rav said that you could slaughter a korban pesach for a mechusar kippurim, somebody who still needs to offer his korbanis. So he hasn't yet offered the korbanis, and yet Rav is saying that you're allowed to slaughter the korban pesach for him. So why should that be any different than a tmei sheretz who still needs to just go to the mikveh and then he'll be good to go? So the Gemara answers, shekino biyado. It's talking about where the mechusar kippurim already has his nest of birds in his hands, and therefore, he's like already on his way to go do his korbanis, so that's why you could slaughter the pesach for him. Tmei sheretz nami ari mikveh lefanov. Okay, so tmei sheretz also. So pashit, there's a mikveh right in front of us. So why can't you shech the korban pesach for him? So dilma pasha. Maybe he's going to be negligent and he won't jump in the mikveh. Hiachim mechusar kippurim nami dilma pasha. But why don't we say the same thing about mechusar kippurim? Maybe he's also going to somehow drop the ball and not offer these birds that are in his hands. So kagon demasunu levezdin uchdur of shmaya. Well, it's talking about where he already gave them over to Bezdin, and it's like Reb Shmaya that we learned about Masechta Eruvin, Damar Chizkiya. The funny thing is, I feel like actually this I said a minute ago that there was that thing in Eruvin where like we were talking about Tuma and it was like easy compared to Eruvin. I feel like actually this Gemara was like in the same area. Damar Chazaka in Bezdin Shakanim Omdim Misham Ad Shichlu Ma'oshib Shafaros. That the Bezdin doesn't get up from there, the Kohanim don't get up from there until they finish all the money in the shofaros. What does that mean? It means that basically if you had a korban, like a korban, if you were mechusar kippurim and you had to bring korbanos, so there was a pushkedar in the Beis HaMikdash, in the higher bayis, that you would put some money there, and the Kohanim wouldn't leave the Beis HaMikdash at the end of the day until all the money that was put into the pushke was used for the korbanos, and everybody's korbans were offered. So basically, if you had to bring a korban, you were mechusar kippurim, you had to bring a korban, so you put some money into the pushke, and then you can assume that as long as you put your money there in, so then the kohanim offered your korbanos for you. So therefore, that's what it's talking about. The mechusar kippurim that Rav says that you'd be allowed to slaughter the korban pesach for is specifically talking about somebody who already put his money in the pushke, and then so you can assume that his korbanos are going to be offered, and therefore you could slaughter the korban pesach for him, as opposed to the tmei sheretz, he still has to go to the mikveh. So now 1 second, are we assuming that according to Rav mida oraisa a tmei sheretz you would be allowed to slaughter the korban pesach for him? But the Rabbanan say no, meaning from the fact that we're saying that we're concerned, don't slaughter a korban pesach for a tmei sheretz because we're concerned. Even though mida oraisa you would be allowed to slaughter the korban pesach for him, we're concerned that what if he doesn't end up going to the mikveh, then you slaughter the korban pesach for somebody who you weren't supposed to. But 1 second, we learned the other day that according to Rav, what you do when you have 50% of Am Yisrael is Tameh and 50% of Am Yisrael is Tahor, what do? You take a sheretz and you throw it at somebody, and he becomes Tmei sheretz. Now he cannot offer the korban pesach, so now everyone just does it betuma. Now, if Rav's opinion is that a Tmei sheretz mida oraisa, you are allowed to slaughter the korban pesach for him, so then how does throwing a dead sheretz at somebody help? Rather, says Rav, no, mida oraisa, somebody who's a tmei sheretz is unable to offer. You're not allowed to slaughter a korban pesach for somebody who's a tmei sheretz. Mida oraisa. Tichsiv, as the pasuk says, ish ish ki yeh tami lanefesh. If you have a fellow who is tami lanefesh, so it's in the context of Pesach Sheni. Milo askinu shechol shvi shelo lios be'erev Pesach. Aren't we talking about even a fellow who his last day of Tumah is on Erev Pesach? So even if you have a fellow, it's his 7th day of Tumah, right? He's a Tmei Meis on day 7, and all he has to do now is go to the mikveh, and then that night he'll be tahor. I guess assuming that, well, there's also, I guess, the sprinkling of the mechatas, but that night he'll be able to be tahor. Dahanu Tumas sheretz, which is essentially the same thing as Tumas sheretz, where right now he's tamei, but as long as he just does what he needs to that day, he can be tahor by that night. And nonetheless, the Torah says, don't do the korban pesach now, do pesach sheni. And if you're going to say, how do you know that this is specifically talking about Tmei Meis on day 7? Because Rav holds like Rabbi Yitzchak, Damar Tmei Meis Mitzvah Hayu, who says that when the pasuk is talking about these people who were Tamei Lanefesh, and they're good, and the instruction is to do Pesach Sheni, it's fellows who were Tamei from a Meis Mitzvah. Shechol Shvi Shalom Lios Be'erev Pesach, that day 7 was Erev Pesach. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, V'lo yochlu la'asos haPesach bayom hahu, that they were unable to do the korban Pesach specifically on that day. Bayom hahu, hu de'enon yichol nasos. Yeah, davka, that day they were unable to do korban Pesach. Aval l'mocher yichol nasos, they would have been able to do korban Pesach already the next day. It was day 7, and yet, Bam Rachman nidchu, and still the Torah said that they should do Pesach Sheni. So we see that even somebody who's able to become Torah by the nighttime, still they do Pesach Sheni, and that's why Rav would assume that even a Tmei sheretz would davka do Pesach Sheni, and you wouldn't slaughter korban Pesach for a Tmei sheretz. Now, says the Gemara Tanan, we learn in our Mishnah, Zav Shira Shtei Re'iyos, if you have a fellow who saw Ziva twice, Shochten Olav Bashvi, so it says that we could slaughter the korban Pesach for him on day 7, right? You have a fellow, he was a Zav, it's day 7, he goes to the mikveh, and that night will be tahor. You're allowed to slaughter the korban Pesach for him. My lab de lo tavil. Mistame, says the Gemara, it's talking about where he didn't yet go to the mikveh. Vishmamina shochtem v'zorken al tmei sheretz. And therefore we'll say that just like you have a Zav, and the Mishnah is saying that you're allowed to slaughter a korban Pesach for a Zav on day 7, and we want to say it's even if he hasn't gone to the mikveh, which means that he's basically the same exact thing as a Tmei sheretz who hasn't yet gone to the mikveh. And the Mishnah is saying that you're allowed to include him in your korban Pesach. So Rav, shouldn't you be allowed to include a Tmei sheretz in the korban Pesach? So lo, titavil. Says the Gemara, no. The Mishnah, when it says you could slaughter a korban Pesach for a Zav bashvi shelo, he already went to the mikveh. But titavil, my kamashmalan. But if he already went to the mikveh, so then what's the big deal? Ha kamashmalan. This is what it's teaching us, that afagav de mechusa of shemesh, that even though he still needs to wait to the evening. Kamashmalan de shimsha mimela arva, and it's teaching us that since the sun is obviously going to set that evening, you can slaughter korban Pesach for this Zav bashvi shelo who already went to the mikveh, because there's really nothing else that's left to be done. He's going to be tahor by the evening. Hachinami mistavra, and it also makes sense to say that when the Mishnah is talking about a Zav, it's davka talking about Zav bashvi shelo, and he already went to the mikveh. Midiktani sefer, from the fact that the Mishnah continues and says Ra shalosh riyos, that if you have a fellow who saw Ziva 3 times, which means that now he has to bring korbanos on day 8, shochten olav bashmini, you're allowed to slaughter the korban Pesach for him on day 8. Now, so I understand if you say that the Zav who saw Ziva twice, and now it's day 7, it makes sense if we're saying that he already went to the mikveh, and you can include him in your korban Pesach. Itztrich, now I need to teach separately about the Zav who saw Ziva 3 times on day 8. Why? I would think that a fellow who saw Ziva twice, and now it's day 7, and he already went to the mikveh, and there's really nothing else that needs to happen. But a fellow who saw Ziva 3 times, and now it's day 8, and he hasn't yet brought his korbanis, where he's mamish missing activity, he's got to do stuff, so I would think that maybe you would be unable to slaughter the korban pesach for him. So therefore it's teaching that even though he still needs to offer the korbanos on day 8, you're still allowed to include him in the korban pesach. But if you say that the Mishnah, when it says a fellow who saw Ziva twice, and now it's day 7, if you want to argue that he has not yet gone to the mikveh, well then what's the Hekdesh? Why do I need the Mishnah to teach us that a fellow who sees Ziva 3 times, now it's day 8, you can include him in the pesach? Because I can learn it out, it's obvious. If you have a fellow who saw Ziva twice, and now it's day 7, and he has not yet gone to the mikveh, he's mamish tameh, he hasn't yet gone to the mikveh, he's mamish tameh. And yet, we can slaughter the korban pesach and the zrikas adam for this tameh fellow. A fellow who saw Ziva 3 times, and now it's day 8, that he already went to the mikveh the day before, on day 7. All he needs to do now is bring korbanis. The klisha tuma, that the tuma is basically gone. It's weak. The only thing that's missing is that he has to bring korbanis. That's it. Lo kol shekei d'shachtin v'zakin anilave. Then certainly I would argue that if I can do the zrika, if I could do shchita for a zav who saw ziva twice, and now it's on day 7, and he's mamish tameh, and he hasn't gone to the mikveh yet, if I could slaughter the korban pesach for him, certainly mechusar kippurim, mechusar kippurim, kilo azav who saw ziva 3 times, and now it's day 8, he's already tar because he went to the mikveh the day before, he just needs to bring korbanis. Certainly, I would be able to slaughter the korban pesach for him. So therefore, it must be that the zav that we're talking about, who saw ziva twice, and now it's day 7, it must be that he already went to the mikveh. The tlisha tumalo koshkin the shachtin of zakin lave ela lav shmamina ra shtei re'os bashvi the shachtin and lave the tavil. So it must be that the fellow who saw ziva twice, and now it's day 7, Itaka already went to the mikveh. Lo the olamim alach the lo tavil. Really, I'll say that the Mishnah is talking about a fellow who saw Ziva twice, and now it's day 7, and he has not yet gone to the mikveh, and you're still allowed to include him in the korban pesach. Well then, what's the Hekdesh of the fellow who saw Ziva 3 times, and now it's day 8? Ve'itztrich, we needed the Mishnah to teach us about this fellow of 3 re'iyos on day 8, sakadati chamina, because I would have thought to say, bashvi hu tibiyadu l'sakin, that the zav bal shtei re'iyos, now that it's day 7, it's all in his hands. All he needs to do is go to the mikveh. There's nothing preventing him from doing so. But a zav who saw Ziva 3 times, and now it's day 8, that he has to bring korbanis, he's not offering the korbanis, the kohen is offering the korbanis for him. He's reliant upon other people. There's external dependencies. I may have thought to say that, what if the kohanim are negligent? So Kamash Malan, like Rabbi Shai, that once he puts the money in the pushke, so then he can assume that the korbanos have been offered. But we could still argue that the Mishnah is dafka talking about a zav who has not yet gone to the mikveh, which is interesting. Because we've been talking, it's been coming up, this question of people who are tameh, it's the last day, they're able to become tahor. I mean, it sounds like we're arguing that our Mishnah is saying that if you have a zav and he has not yet gone to the mikveh, i.e. right now he's tameh, but he's able to become tahor, so then you can shech the korban pesach for him. Ve'azava shochten v'chule, if you have a zava, so then, it depends. If she's shomer yom kineged yom, so you could slaughter korban pesach for her that day. If she is a zava and now it's day 8, you could slaughter korban pesach for her. Tanitana kamed of adabar ahave. So a teacher taught in front of adabar ahava. Ve'azava shochten olea bashvi shela. If you have mamish a zava, you could slaughter korban pesach even on day 7. Amrle, Rav adabar ahava said to this fellow, zava bashvi shela. Huh? Michazia? How could you slaughter a korban pesach for a zava on day 7? even according to Ula, even according to Manda Amru, who says that you would be allowed to do Shchita and Zrika for a Tmei Sheretz, well, Hanemile Tmei Sheretz Dechazi Le'urta, that's because a Tmei Sheretz will be Tahor already that night. But Ad L'machar D'Maseh Kapara Lo Chazia. But a Zava, until day 8, when she brings her korbanis, she's not fit. So how on day 7 can you argue that you could slaughter korban pesach for her? She's not going to be fit until the next day. Ema bashmini. So rather I'll say on day 8. But pshita, isn't that obvious? No, I may have thought to say, just like we had said, that, well, since she's lacking kapara, maybe I wouldn't be allowed to slaughter korban pesach for her kamash milan, like kamash milan, like Reb Shmai, that as long as she put some money in the pushke, in the harabayas, so then she can assume that the korbanis will be offered and she could be included in the korban pesach. Ravina Amar Nida Tana Kame. So Ravina says that this teacher in front of Rav Ada bar Ahava actually taught that it wasn't a zava, it was a nida. Ve'anida shochtin alea bashvi'i. That a nida you'd be allowed to slaughter korban pesach for her on day 7. Now this is talking about nida mida oraisa, right? Nida mida oraisa is that when a woman sees dam, then for 7 days she is a nida, and that is the entire day 7. Then she would go to the mikveh that night at the end of day 7, but she would really only become tahor the following evening when with Harav Shemesh, because you need Harav Shemesh. So for example, if you have a Tavul Yom, let's say a Zav on day 7, a Zav Katan on day 7, so he goes to the mikveh, he's a Tavul Yom for the rest of the day, and then comes that night, once you have Harav Shemesh, now he's Tahor. So here also, if you have this, you have a woman who's a Nida, so you need to wait the entire full 7 days, Mida Oraisa, and then at the end of the 7th day, she would go to the mikveh, after Shkia, but then the Harav Shemesh wouldn't be until the following day. So therefore, V'anida shochten alea bashvi, so that this fellow said in front of Rav Ada bar Ahava that a nida on day 7, you would be allowed to include her in the korban pesach. But bashvi, michazis, she fit on day 7. Afilu Manda Amr shochten v'zarkan al tmei sheretz, even according to Manda Amr who says that you'd be allowed to slaughter korban pesach for a tmei sheretz, t'chazi le'orta, that's because a fellow who's a tmei sheretz, at least that night, will be able to eat the korban pesach. But nida, the orta de shvi, who the tavla, but a nida is only first going to go to the mikvah that night. Ad Shmini the Avda Harav Shemesh, and now until the Harav Shemesh of day 8, Lo Chazah, she's not going to be able to eat the korban pesach. So Ema Bashmini, rather I'll say on day 8, she'd be allowed to be included in the korban pesach, because that night with Harav Shemesh she'll be tar. So Pshita, that's obvious. Hashta Umazavad Mechasa Kapara Shochtim V'Zarkin Alea. Right? That if you have a Zava, who on day 8 she still has to bring korbanis, and still you could include her in the korban pesach. Bashmini on day 8. Nida de lo mechasa kapara, a nida who doesn't need to bring any korbanis, she just needs to wait until the sun sets. Tzricha lememra, do you even have to tell me? T'shachtinu v'zakin Allah, that you can do shchita and zrika for a nida, it's tzricha. No, we needed to teach it because HaKamash Milan is teaching us bashmini im bashvi lo, that after on day 8, you can slaughter a korban pesach for, but day 7 would not work. In the Tanyas, we learned in a brayso called chayve tvilosun bayom, that in general, when it comes to somebody who needs to go to the mikvah, so you go to the mikvah during the day, and then you're mechusar kippurim, and you wait, and then you're a tvul yom, and then with harav shemesh you're tahor. However, nida v'yoledes tvilosun balayla. However, a nida and a woman who gives birth and then is tamei and tahor has that whole period where she's got to wait. So then they go to the mikveh davka at night. The Tanya, as we learn in the Brayso, Yachol te toveles mi ba'od yom. Is it possible that she will go to the mikveh during the day? Tamalomer, therefore it says shivas yom tia benidasa tehei benidasa kol shiva. That for 7 days she'll be a nida. She'll be a nida for all 7 days. If yoledes ishkas lenida, and we compare yoledes to a nida, and therefore just like a nida would be all 7 days, and it goes to the mikveh the following night. So the same thing applies to a yoledes. That was daf tzadi. I think it was a pretty complicated daf, right? So the first part of the daf talks about being mechal money of hekdesh on a korban pesach, and that kind of got us into that machlokas. Well, really the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who says that in general, when it comes to kachim kalim, it's mamun bailim. The kachim kalim belongs to the person who consecrated them, and we have Rebbe who says that specifically when it comes to korban pesach, when you set aside a korban pesach, you still retain like a certain amount of it that you retain for yourself, and therefore, like let's say Esnan, I would think at least that Esnan Zona would be able to be machalal on that part of the korban. Now there's also implications for the money, that for example, if Shimon wants to buy into Reuven's korban, when he sets it aside with the intention that Reuven can kind of spend it as he wishes. We discussed if somebody buys into your korban pesach, to what extent can you spend that money? So the Chacham say that you can only spend it on like the eating of the korban, whereas Rebbe says you can even spend it on other things as well. So there's machlokas between Reb Zera and Rabbah. One opinion is that everyone agrees that when it comes to like wood and things like that you mamish need to cook the korban pesach, you'd be allowed to spend money that people paid you to join the korban pesach on that. Where they argue is when it comes to like matzah and maror, which are kind of meta things that you need in the context of korban pesach. The Tanna Kama says no, Rebbe says yes. The other way of looking at it is that no, even by matzah and maror, everyone agrees that you'd be allowed to spend money on that. Where the machlokas is regarding like if he needs to buy like clothing for Yom Tif, can he spend it on that? Tanna Kama says no, Rebbe says yes. And then we got into this interesting sugya about basically different tumas on day 7. It really gets interesting davka in the context of like tumas sheretz. Right, so meaning you have this fellow who he could be tahor that night, but he still needs to go to the mikveh. Rav says that you cannot slaughter for somebody who's tamei tumas sheretz because he still has to go to the mikveh, even though it will be tahor that night. He didn't go to the mikveh yet, and so you can't slaughter for him. Whereas Ula is of the opinion that no, you can slaughter korban pesach for tamei sheretz. All he needs to do is go to the mikveh. It's in his hands to be tahor by the nighttime, and that's okay. That was Aftzari. I hope you enjoyed it. Peace out.